Hello there. My name is Jessica Crow, and I am the founder of Apogy. And Apogy is a change management training, coaching, and consulting firm. And this is Apogy's Change Leader Speaker Series. And today I have here with me Dr. Ross Wirth. And I met him a couple of years ago virtually as we were both on LinkedIn and connected to a change management group there. Excuse me. And then he started a network that I became connected to. And I'd love for him to tell you about that and introduce himself, and then we'll get started with the conversation. But thank you so much, Dr. Wirth, for being here. Tell us a little bit about who you are and your background and the different platforms that you are currently overseeing and sort of how you got started in that space.
I could probably use up a couple hours talking about that, but I'll try to keep it short. I've got a long career. I'm actually in my third career now. My first career was with International Oil, where I served really across the organization, starting in IT by way of marketing, retail and wholesale marketing, supply and distribution, HR for one cycle, spent a couple cycles through corporate planning, both operational and strategic planning. Did a little bit of everything, but it really centered around special projects, the types of things that didn't fit neatly anywhere else. I would oftentimes change jobs every 18, 24 months, always having the next idea on the corner of my desk that would build into the next project.
Oh, cool.
After 32 years there, I got a little tired, and I was being recruited to go into academia. I turned them down once because I had a pretty interesting project going at that time. But when that project finished, they recruited me again with actually even a better position. So I went into academia first as program chair for business administration. This was overseeing the curriculum and teaching undergraduate business administration. Later, I was promoted to the dean of the College of Business, where I served there for a while. Then family brought me back to Oklahoma. And I'm in my third career now, doing some consulting and really just meeting people like you and others around the world. One of the challenges I have is putting together sessions because we literally have members around the world now.
Yes.
And a lot of times we have to do 2 sessions just to be able to get everyone in.
Yeah. I think when you and I met, actually, you may have just been retiring from your second career, starting your third career.
Yes, right. Yep. And at that time, we started the Change Management Network. And this was basically building a more robust platform, multiple topics, subgroups, a little bit more that you could find on Facebook or LinkedIn. We were constantly focusing on the frontier of organizational change. What's working, what's not working, what are some new ideas? And from that, we really came to some understanding that we don't necessarily need new change models as much as we need a new way of thinking about change within organizations.
Right.
And this is where you started to get into a tight linkage really between organization design and organization change, because oftentimes our organizations are built for stability. They're built to control work more than they're built to produce work. Right. And that's a kind of a fine line, but when you do an analysis of change failures, a lot of times it's not necessarily the change process or the intent, but the entire system that the organization is structured around fights the change. So oftentimes the pressure for change is suppressed until it gets to such a point where it blows up and you have to do a change, but then it becomes reactive. And too often you're seeing organizations that are fighting the symptoms because they waited too long and they don't have time to really get down into the core problems themselves.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and so when you started the Change Management Network, you eventually changed the name to Futocracy, I believe, to sort of to address some of that shift. And now you've recently launched a newsletter called Management Minefields. So you're, over the past couple of years, what I've seen is the work that you're doing, the the conversations that you're hosting and cultivating through the platforms that you've created are really creating space for this idea of how do we think differently about change management? How do we think differently about organizational design? And I think we're in this interesting space where the pandemic in many ways accelerated some of the shift that's been happening organizationally from that model of we've got hierarchies and systems of control to now the organization is so much more flat and it's project-based work and it's also built for productivity. And so some of the thinking that existed and that was created in relation to change management, over pre-pandemic, we'll say it's not as, there's a need to change because those models and that thinking isn't as effective in the new environment. And so that's at least what I'm seeing with clients. And it sounds like you have been looking at this for quite some time. And I know you've got a colleague, several colleagues that you've been studying this. What are some of the most, what are some of the key takeaways that you're finding in terms of this system of control that's kind of evolving in the workplace? And as a leader or a manager, and regardless if you have a change management background or training, how should you be thinking about this? How should you be preparing for this shift or even dealing with the shift that's already taken place in the organization? That tension between resistance and the need for change to stay relevant.
The whole idea of shifting to Futocracy.Network was the realization that we are moving beyond change management.
Mm-hmm.
Change management is a term I really don't like.
Same.
because it's really three components. You can manage the process, but you have to lead the vision for change.
Yep.
But to that, I add a third component called change enablement.
Mm-hmm.
That focuses on the people side because
Absolutely.
The people side is so important. And too often, if you focus just on the process of the vision, you're still leaving the people out.
Yep.
So Futocracy is trying to figure out how to do things simply so that they are, so that they are understanding where they exist in organizations as their linkage to the purpose, how they align themselves. And part of this gets into rethinking a lot that we take for granted. We often do things in our paradigm without really thinking. That's almost by definition. People can say you need to get out of your box, but people that are in boxes, they don't know they're in a box. All they see are the walls around them. Right. It's not until you're outside the box that you realize that you were in a box.
Right.
So the challenge then is how to get people to think differently. And Futocracy.Network is part of that. And you mentioned we're moving forward now into the management minefields, which is more of an outreach to try to reach the managers at all levels of an organization. Too often, change is really seen as a specialist area.
Right. And in the past, for sure. Yeah.
And when you look at the curriculum in a college degree program, a management or leadership degree will have one course for organizational change.
Right.
And that's an elective. And there's a prerequisite called organizational behavior, which oftentimes is also a prerequisite. So very few people in those degrees even get to that level of understanding. And that's probably a pretty just awareness level. When you talk about HR, similarly there's generally one organization development course, but again, it's an elective with a prerequisite that's in place for organization behavior. So again, even the HR people are coming out with degrees and not really knowing much about change. Within management or leadership, you might get one lecture on change, which is just, that's just touching the tip. Okay, so the key then is, where do people learn in organizations about organizational change?
Right.
And Generally,
That's where
they
you and I
learn
come in.
well, no, actually, they learn it before we get in there. Yeah, we
True,
get in,
right?
yeah,
For
we
better or
get in
for worse.
there, yeah, we get in there when they're having failures
Right.
because they generally learn it from observations on previous positions, previous change.
Mm-hmm.
So observational learning is probably the way that most managers learn about change. And for the most part, they learn what not to do or what they didn't like. They don't necessarily learn what they should be doing.
Right, right. Yeah, you're absolutely
So,
right. So one
yep.
thing that we have, we think about this the same way. At Apogee, we talk about developing change leaders at all levels in the organizations because, like you, so I was trained in change management as a specialist over a decade ago. But when I went into other roles and I was still using my change management training, it occurred to me that everyone should understand the mechanics, the concepts, the thinking behind change management so they can adapt it and use it in whatever role that they're in. It's relevant for all roles. And so what I've been trying to do is educate organizations and leaders and clients on this is a skill that is absolutely a specialist role, but it's really a leadership, a management capability, and thinking about it in a new way. Like, yes, there's process and tools, but to your point earlier, when you said you're sort of missing that people side, which is kind of ironic in a way because the whole practice of change management is meant to think about like how do you influence people, change behaviors. What's been missing, I think, is that human side, that caring for the human side of change, that building of connection. And so one thing that I have seen, and I've had the opportunity to interview a professor up at the University of Colorado who is in the ESG department of the business school. And he talks a lot about compassion and developing compassionate leaders and having that be related to, understanding how to lead change because he's tapping into that more human aspect and element. Have you seen that? Has that come up for you at all? This idea of developing compassionate leaders who understand also how to lead change using both, the process and tools, but also leaning into the soft skills, the power skills that make them human.
I probably come at it from even a higher level,
Yeah.
from a systems thinking standpoint. And this is hard to explain because it's thinking from the big picture and the small at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I say it's hard to explain in that when I'm looking at a problem, my mind is rapidly shifting back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of times you talk about, you can't see the forest for the trees.
Right.
And that's the problem, that most people only see one. They don't see both. And in reality, you need to shift back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's probably the bigger skill that needs to be developed to understand how things fit together, to question what we believe and why we believe it,
Mm-hmm.
and to search for other confirming or disconfirming evidence. And part of this then obviously gets into the people side.
Right.
And it's the change enablement, as I said earlier, it's where are they in their change process?
Mm-hmm.
How aligned are they with the sense making? A lot of times we think about change resistance, but it's only because we're not involving them enough that they understand as much as you do. And that's one of the problems. Right. That's one of the problems with large change initiatives, in that they do a lot of the analysis, they do a lot of the sense making, they determine a path forward, and then they spring it with a selling communication program.
Right.
But they've left everyone else behind because at that point they think that everyone knows what they know, and they've overlooked how much further they've gone, where the majority of people that are being forced into the change, they don't even know that the problem exists.
Right. Yeah,
the
that's
impact of it.
Right.
So part of the thing that we need to get managed at all levels is somewhat awareness that suppressing change does not reduce the need for change.
Mm-hmm.
It only makes it more disruptive and reactive later. And there's certain things about how you involve people, but at that point, it starts to really transition away from change as much as into how you really lead an organization or manage an organization.
Mm-hmm.
That's a critical component. And I think that's something that we are starting to see the tip of an iceberg emerge in the pandemic, post-pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
era. For the most part, when you take a look at what organizations did early on, they basically just went to a reactive change mode, going to remote to try to keep the business alive.
Right. Right.
They really didn't do it strategically. It was a total reaction just to be able to survive.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And they didn't really think at all about the changes in management style or leadership style. And now you're starting to see some of that conflict come back in place because you're now trying to go back to old ways. You're struggling with how to do things strategically
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of strategic thinking was put off to the side because it wasn't done easily remote.
You're in survival mode too, right?
That's right. And they're now starting to think about strategic and how do you do strategic sense making when people are remote.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, the people have realized that it's not so much the remote, but the flexibility
Yes.
that remote gives them that they like.
Right. Right.
And you're seeing a large number of discussions around the great quit, the great resignation,
Mm-hmm.
those where people are changing jobs, particularly the white collar. This has not been that unusual of a turnover among the service level employees,
Mm-hmm.
but for the more office level employees, it's going up dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some of that was basically postponed.
Right. Agreed. Yeah.
But it's increasing now. But what's even more interesting, though, is the great regret.
This is the next one. Okay, here we go. Tell me about it.
Okay, the great resignation has led to a lot of people changing jobs, but the great regret now is coming out in the research that a significant, like half the number of people that are changing jobs are dissatisfied and are looking for changing jobs again.
I'm not surprised by that actually, because I have, my husband is actually trying to hire people, and it's hard for everyone to hire. And there's that, people are jumping jobs and chasing salaries. But I've found, and through some of the research that I found, that a year later they're back on the market, or 6 months later, and the grass isn't necessarily greener. So I'm not surprised to hear that. So I guess that is kind of the next frontier for employees, so to speak.
Let me put this into another context.
Yeah.
Gary Hamel and Zanani put together a book a few years ago called Humanocracy. Very good book. It lays out a vision for a more human-centric organization.
Yeah.
And to a large extent, if you're going to be a more advanced, quicker responding, you've got to bring the people in and really release their passion for work versus trying to control their work.
Yes, yes.
They do a really good job of laying out the foundation. They don't do as good a job, though, of how to transition an organization. And that's where Dr. Butterfield and I have been focusing on how do you actually transition? Because when you look at alternate structures that are in place, for the most part, they're startups, or they're very small, or in a few large organizations, they went through a crisis. Okay, but the more mature, larger organizations without any of those three components have a very difficult time changing. So there's certain things you need to be able to think differently about how to do it. But in Humanocracy, the others make an interesting point in that they see the human-centric movement of being the next large-scale social movement.
That makes sense.
They put it in the realm, though, of the labor unions, the women's suffrage, the civil rights, which are all massive in the streets protests. But you don't see any of that for the human movement. There's a lot of complaints, but the physical movement's not there. And I was wondering, what's it going to take, or where's that movement at, or why hasn't it been happening? And then it occurred to me that the world is now different, is now the internet world. So the question comes, how does a social movement like civil rights, labor, women's suffrage, how does that exhibit itself in an internet world?
Right. Well, so since I'm not from, I think you've mentioned the book to me in the past, or over email, and I haven't had a chance to check it out. and so people who are watching this video, can you describe what that ideal, what that future model is? And then maybe we can think about, like that's a really good point. Like, how do you do this in an online environment? So what is that? How did the authors describe that ideal model where the organization is built for work versus control?
They kept it rather general.
Mm-hmm.
They went through a large number of case studies, and they identified the principles associated with those different organizations that they use for operating.
Mm-hmm.
What they did not do, that Reg and I have really continued to focus on, is how do you synthesize something from that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The book itself basically lays out, here's some examples, which basically says it's very doable.
Right.
Then it goes through the statement that we're on a cusp of a social movement. And then it ends with, here's some things that individual managers can do within their area of influence.
Got it.
Now, what they did not do is synthesize from all of these different studies a common set. And when you look at the different alternate structures or alternate operating styles, there's a great deal of similarity. And individually, they all have some minor difficulties.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, you might do away with bureaucratic decision-making through a hierarchy, but you add to bureaucracy of involving people and documenting.
Right.
Okay. So in some cases, it's a trade-off of bureaucracy or types of bureaucracy. So what Dr. Butterfield and I tried to do was take a look at all those different examples and come up with a set of common principles.
Mm-hmm.
And we really came up with 5 principles.
Yeah. What are those?
So, okay. The first is really alignment, purpose alignment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's critical. And when we talk about doing transitions from a very traditional organization to alternate structures, alignment becomes a critical component, and you can use what we're calling a purpose alignment team.
Mm-hmm.
In that you could put a purpose alignment team in place that is similar to Kotter's shadow organization.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that it's operating in the background, but it does a lot of the things that are often ignored. So that's a critical component. Another that you see across most of these alternate structures is distributed decision-making.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times they do it with different types of, not necessarily consensus, but consent. Difference between consensus and consent is very different. But
Okay.
you could do a lot of quick decision-making with consent process.
Got it.
Okay, that's a distributed decision-making process. And a lot of times you could get there halfway by the way you empower people.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge there, though, is if it's a delegation, there's also an implied ability to pull back that delegation. So it's never really a total freedom itself.
Right. What impact would that, just as you were saying that, though, it also made me think about, would organizations have to restructure how accountability for P&L and different areas of budget? Because that would be something too. If you have consent, that's one thing, but if there's funds that are going to be distributed in some way, there has to be a reconfiguration to enable that change ready environment at a much deeper, level. Yep. Do you agree with that, or have you thought that through?
I totally agree with that, and you're getting ahead of me.
Oh, sorry. Carry on.
No, because you're on the right track, though, because this is the type of process you need to think about, though, is that when you change one thing, it ripples. And so you have to figure out how things go. Now, another key component, though, is that if you try to replace the control, you can't necessarily replace control because there is some need for control.
Right.
So the challenge then is, how do you modify and go to a softer form of control? Okay, so for example, if you do distributed decision-making, okay, someone can argue, so that's going to be anarchy. Everyone's going to be doing their own thing.
Well, it's Lord of the Flies. Whoever has the conch has the power.
Yeah, that's right. And see, and this is where you need to think through the principles and how they work together.
Uh-huh.
So, for example, principle of purpose alignment creates some tension with distributed decision making.
Okay.
And you make that tension very explicit so that you say, go ahead and do your decisions, but at the same time, this other's over here pulling you back for alignment.
Mm-hmm.
So you have those two in critical alignment. What you were getting to earlier then is how do you actually do this?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you say someone, go out and do decisions within your area, okay, well, what do?
Right.
They have no guidance. And the guidance is available and actually comes from the theory of effectuation.
Okay.
Effectuation came out of the study of successful entrepreneurs. What do successful entrepreneurs do that unsuccessful ones don't do? And it comes up with another 5 principles there.
Okay.
And basically using those 5 principles of effectuation then gives an individual guidance of how to make decisions. So for example, don't worry about what you can't control.
I need to hear that more often. Yep, got it.
Right. Okay. In which case you do what you can. Okay.
Right.
Which is the second component is that you become means driven, not goals driven.
Right.
Most organizations will set up a goal and then will back source the resources.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in successful entrepreneurs, they look at what they've got and they use that to do what they can.
Right.
Now, a critical component of that is the third in that you partner with others.
Yeah.
You don't try to do it all yourself. You
Yeah.
partner with others, but you also create strategic possibilities by partnering with others. You're creating the relationships that you may use, but you don't know. It's basically like a strategic Slack.
Right.
So that you're always becoming aware of what's available. So when you need it, you pull it in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Then it's a focus on how you think about risk differently.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times we try to manage risk statistically and reduce the risk. But a statistical point on risk could mean that you accept a significant risk. Would it happen? Okay. And also it slows you down. It slows you down by going with higher probabilities, and it slows you down with the decision-making process.
Right.
With effectuation, the risk is flipped around in that you accept the risk if the worst case is affordable.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that makes a lot of sense. I was thinking in the context of a big corporation, how often does that happen? I think it does, right? In many ways. One thing that you said though that got me thinking about how this could be challenging and would require, and it makes a lot of sense at the same time, but organizations, especially public companies, where they are goals driven, they've got, let's say it's healthcare or real estate or whatever it might be. They've got goals that they're trying to achieve, and then they backfill with the people to achieve those roles. And so one thing when I was in-house, it was always, how did we do? How did we do? And you forget the process, like that journey matters. That's your transition. That's the change piece that change management, change professionals are looking at, but that gets ignored because it's so goals oriented. Now for public companies that have, there's stakeholders and shareholders and investment organizations that have an expectation on performance, how would you apply what you're saying to those types of organizations where they've got this high intensity, high pressure demands to deliver based on goals? Where does what you described fit in with that, the means? How would that work in that context?
We're working with a large global organization right now.
Mm-hmm.
And the easiest place to start is on the purpose side.
Uh-huh.
Not focusing on the goals, but focus on the purpose.
Shift your just start there versus got it. Okay. So tell us more about that then. Like, what are some of
the key there then is what determines the purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And that immediately gets you to a customer orientation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And by moving to a customer orientation, you also reduce a lot of defensiveness.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because things are now being put into the frame of the purpose to meet the needs of the customer. And the other internal issues then become secondary of let's focus on purpose and the customer and then see how we can meet those needs better.
Got it. And so are you saying too that purpose is different than a company's mission and values, or is it somewhat similar, but how would you make that, how would you explain that?
I see it as a higher order.
Okay.
Okay. I've had this conversation recently in that the mission is kind of putting the purpose into place today.
Mm-hmm.
The vision is putting the purpose into place in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And in the background then is the values that determine how you really implement that purpose.
Got it. It's like the consensus around how you do that. Okay.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. It's kind of there. You can move values a little bit, but it's very hard. About the only way you move it is by bringing in new people, and that becomes disruptive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And again, for the most part, the values almost become self-aligned with the purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're really purpose focused, that determines a set of values that will support it. And to the extent that the values conflict, those conflicts will come to the surface.
Right. Got it. So for organizations that have been operating for quite some time, they have their mission, vision, values that they put out there for the reasons that you described, but now they're thinking about purpose and connecting purpose and starting there. What you're not saying is they need to go out and revisit their values and change them. What you're saying is, as you start to focus on purpose and connecting with customer needs, that naturally you'll start to see what the organization values based on what the customers value, and there'll be some sort of natural integration that just happens, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And again, a lot of times organizations spend time early on crafting the mission, vision, values statement versus letting it emerge through a sense-making process.
Tell us a little bit more. Sorry, and I want to hear the end of the rest of what you had to say, but you've used the term sense making a few times, and I think I know what it means, but since there are going to be people who are watching this video that may not be familiar with that, do you mind just touching on what that means, how you describe that real quickly?
It's really coming to a common shared understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so for example, are there organization problems? Okay, everybody's going to see the problems from their perspective. Sense making occurs when they start to talk about it jointly.
Got
and
it.
they
Okay.
share the different perceptions. And through the dialogue, they start to understand it from a bigger, more global perspective of how it really operates. You know,
Okay.
what are the patterns that are in place that are driving activities? How do we have different assumptions that drive the actions we take?
Got it. Okay.
How do we validate? How do we involve people? All of that requires part of a organic sense making. But if you come to a sense making consensus, and again, it's not just a permanent, because it's always evolving.
Mm-hmm.
It's a dynamic process. And it's how you create the input from across the organization, from outside the organization, into that dialogue thinking process, that it really becomes something that's more powerful than just a statement that you could put in a book or on the wall.
Right.
And that is something that people internally understand and are able to use in their daily decisions. And this is where the principles come back in. In that the principles give you the guidelines and the guardrails then of making decisions such that you can do things without being managed or being directed.
Got it. Okay.
And then that allows activities to happen much quicker. And then once you enable that, then the change, when recognized, can happen more organically. And if it is a larger impact, you have the freedom then to network and pull other people in, such that the people who need to be in the room can make the decision. And if the risk is affordable, then they go full forward. Now, that still gives some possibilities of, are they resource bound? Well, again, you don't worry about the resources, you do what you can. And to the extent that the resource limitations become a true limiting factor, then how do you bring other people into the process to expand the resources that are available? So it's a different way of thinking about how organizations run.
Got it. Got it. So it's you're essentially describing just the word culture came to mind, but it's really the interactions and the conversations that are happening in a certain way based on the principles. People are leveraging those to make decisions. You're mobilizing around efforts based on what you have versus hiring for the need and then going out and creating the project. Got it. Okay. And so then from there, you're talking about how organizations, or you were talking about how organizations, they're coming up with their mission and their values and their purpose, but perhaps a more organic process would be appropriate for the reasons that you're describing. And what's interesting about that too, I think where people, culture, toxic cultures and morale gets affected is when you've got these vision values on the wall, but the true values of the organization are different because it's reflective of what people are, what they truly care about and how they're behaving. So that's a really interesting, I like that transition. I think moving towards that will take some people that understand what you're describing, right? Because in the current context, I think that's not generally something that people are thinking about. So
it requires people to interact more,
right?
But it gives them the freedom to interact with the people that they need to be interacting with.
Right.
It
right.
makes
Getting rid of some of that politics could actually be helpful for people.
You cut out the up down. I should say up, across, down, and you just go straight to the person. You focus on different types of informal networks. A lot of times we talk about the formal and the informal, and the informal organizations saw it as being just one network. And that's not the case.
No, yeah.
There's multiple informal networks dependent upon the purpose of the informal networks and how they operate. And the challenge then is to recognize the differences and to be able to create new network connections as needed.
Got it. And how would you, coming back to that idea of we're working in an online environment, we're working virtually, hybrid, in the leveraging the internet. How do you do that in this type of world? Is it easier? Is it harder? I think the relationship building piece, you don't have those spontaneous interactions that can happen in person, but at the same time,
I think it's just different.
Yeah.
Part of this is I've got relationships with people around the world that I've never met. And I have not met in person, and here we are. Exactly right.
Yeah.
I have not met Dr. Butterfield. We've worked together closely for 4 years now.
Oh my goodness, that's cool.
Now we know each other about as well as I know anybody local.
Right.
Okay. But again, it's different in that it doesn't happen as quick as a face-to-face physical connection. It doesn't happen as quick. And I think it also requires a new skill.
Which is?
That new skill is to be more vulnerable.
I believe that.
In that it's easy, even in a physical relationship, it's easy to put up a barrier, and filter yourself. When you're online, it becomes even easier still.
Right.
But you don't really get to know somebody until you become vulnerable. And the other person also is willing to become vulnerable, so you can start to ask the hard questions.
Right.
The questions that you might filter and not say, or you approach from a very tangential point of view.
Right.
Okay. And part of that is also of how to critique without raising defensiveness.
Right.
Okay. And there's something to be said negative about corporate politics, but in the past, I learned a great deal from it.
Right. Yeah.
Many people have used it to their personal advantage and basically use it to create divides.
Yeah.
I was very successful at being able to use it by working in between those divides.
Mm-hmm.
In that I was able to oftentimes be the liaison between two different groups because I was friends really with both sides and I saw both sides and I was a translator. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. That type of skill is probably needed more in the online of how do you reach that level of understanding and communication and create, like, it's difficult to say, I call it fast start teaming.
Yeah, I like that term.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, the normal process of how you get a team up to speed, it really requires people willing to become vulnerable, reaching out and listening. That I think is a critical skill that's needed, not only in the physical world, but even more so in the online world.
I love that you just described that, because I've actually talked about this with clients, and I've had a workshop last year that was about this, change leadership in the digital workplace. And I think people were expecting to come in and hear about digital tools and all the platforms they should use. And I was like, no, you need to get to know people for people and like build relationships and focus on connection, because of the reasons that you just described. As more things become automated and online, we lose that human connection that is accelerated in person. And so being able to do that, especially in the online world, is very important. So we've covered a lot of ground actually here, and sort of from start to finish, how I would think about it is the practice, the focus of change management is evolving. How organizations are built and structured and operating is evolving for a lot of different reasons. There's a need for more awareness of how to navigate change, innovation, organizational design than ever before, because what happened, that shift was accelerated in many ways due to the pandemic out of survival. And now we're in a spot where, how do you deal with the current state? Employees need flexibility. Managers need to figure out how to navigate relationship building, both in person and online. And all of this gets to, if you're going to lead and manage and guide teams in the 21st century and now, you need to not only understand the things that you're describing, those principles, purpose-driven alignment, but also, some of the process and structure and tools. Having that framework for how you approach things practically and emotionally will be important. If you could, just one final takeaway for people who are thinking about, because there's a lot of jobs out there for change management professionals. If you could give some advice to somebody who's looking for a job in change management, or is a leader and manager who wants to do better, make their team more effective, be the change that they want to see in their workplace, what tip would you give them? What final kind of thought would you like to impart?
For the change expert, I would say think about the role as a coach and trainer.
Yep.
Too many change experts try to do the job, and they don't leave value behind them beyond that particular change initiative. Mm-hmm. The main benefit of their involvement will be leaving people behind that will be able to do the majority of the work themselves next time, and then call the change expert in for the very difficult parts or the more specialized types of facilitation.
Yep.
Okay, so it's a different way of thinking about the change expert role. Okay. For the managers at all levels, I think that understanding how to change, or really how to influence others, is a critical component, because without that skill, you're limiting yourself on your ability to reach your goals. Mm-hmm. Because rarely do you, never do you operate in isolation. You're always operating in connection with somebody. And to the extent that the environment is changing, that requires some internal recognition of that change, and that you can't do it alone. You have to involve others. And this is where it gets into some trade-offs in that change often reallocates those internal values, mm-hmm. such that some parts of the organization increase expenses while other parts will increase the value derived. And that requires, again, the vulnerability to get into some tough decisions.
That's right.
And discussions, because your entire compensation, your bonus, your performance system can be impacted, but it's got to be done within the framework of the betterment of the total organization with the realization that things need to ripple around.
Yeah, no, that resonates very much so. Dr. Wirth, you have been, this has been a really informative conversation for me. I've learned a lot, and I appreciate your insights and the research and the work that you and Dr. Butterfield are doing. And I'm just so glad that we crossed paths a couple of years ago and that we've stayed in touch and connected. And where can people find you and the work that you're doing? So if they're interested in learning more and reaching out to you, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
The best spot is Futocracy.Network, Futocracy.Network. We've got multiple topics there. One focuses on designing organizations that are built for change. Another talks about change competencies across the organization. Third, we'll touch base on the human side of organizations. We've got work groups, courses, a little bit of everything there, dependent upon what you want to take away and your particular needs.
Fantastic. And then is the newsletter that you recently started, is that something that people can subscribe to as well?
Yes, there's links there. We're just getting that off the ground. We've actually got 2 newsletters going. I'm editing one on Medium. Dr. Butterfield is editing a second one on Substack. And in both cases, we're taking our ideas, putting it within the framework of more current discussions, and then looking at it from a problem to a solution of how do you need to rethink what you're doing to get better results.
Oh, I love that. That's great. Well, thank you so much again for your time today. And then for everyone who is watching, be sure to check out those links that Dr. Wirth recommended. I am plugged into the work that they're doing and have continued to learn a lot. They've also had global events. And so be sure to check those out too. Some great speakers have been presenting and just a wealth of knowledge. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with my community, with the community of change management professionals that are connected to Apogy, and just really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.
My pleasure. You have a good day too. Thank you.
All right. Thanks.
Bye-bye.